For assignment 3, we're going to be adding fields to your figure ground compositions. For this assignment, you're going to use the same compositions as you had for the previous 2 assignments. And with this project, we're going to start to talk about sight. So you're going to do 1 card for each of your 8 compositions, and you're going to use the same compositions as you have for the last 2 examples. So you will have 2 parallel and aligned figures. You will have 2 versions of staggered figures, 2 versions of edge-aligned figures, and 2 versions of fitted figures. This time, you're going to add to the black figures by cutting yellow trace paper and adding yellow fields, defined fields, to your compositions. The goal of this project is part craft and part critical investigation. All elements, grids, figures, and fields should be well made as a balanced visual composition. In addition, please take notes so that you can describe the result of each card. Using your unlined paper, sketch each card, diagram the defined field, and name the visual results. This is going to come in handy when we pin up. After A3 is when we're going to have our first pin up. There are going to be 8 cards in A3. Look carefully at the examples on page in the assignment. Place some test figures first in trace on existing cards before you make your new ones. You should sketch your ideas before making them, and you should cut the black solids and trace figures with precision and think before you apply glue and put them on the sheet. Here you can see how these defined fields might start to make your compositions more complex. So if you see on the right, the diagram identifies the space defined by the interior boundaries of the composition. And in this example, the 4 squares occupy the space they define. In the example to the right, this is a diagram showing a space defined on 3 sides by the composition, with a 4th edge implied by the proportional center line. Again, defined space follows a simple description. The term identifies an underlying gestalt features of form and space. Our perceptions emerge from the collective set of elements that exist in a composition. Defined spaces result from extending boundaries present in an array. In the case of rectilinear forms, such as our examples, boundaries coincide with edges. Any rectangular form will project 4 boundary lines. So you can sort of see here how very simple and similar compositions can yield different results. These are some examples of this project. So these are staggered figures, and you can see the different alternatives for adding a defined field. These are edge-aligned figures, and again, 3 different examples of how you would add defined field to these. Fitted figures, 3 examples of defined fields that have been added to the same composition. And then this is how these diagrams that you're making, these compositions, might end up becoming a form in the end. So here, the very simple composition to the top right, it shows 3 different ways you might be able to read that composition in 3-dimensional form. 1, it could be simply a plane on the site at ground level. Number 2, it could be a raised roof element. And then it could also be a raised volume. For A4, we're going to simply add another field. So this project uses for its base selected compositions from your previous project. So what that means is I would like for you to choose one set after doing A3 that you are the most interested in and the one that you understand the most, and you're going to take those 4 cards and add to those. So following the review that we're in the pinup, you should consult your section TA and you select one of your 2 composition sequences just completed. You're going to redo 2 copies of each of the 4 compositions in the series, meaning that you'll end up with 8 compositions. To each of these remade compositions, you're going to add a second yellow trace paper field. Again, you're going to paste the elements on the card using either rubber cement or a glue stick, and you will do 2 variations of each card as we're going to talk about here. The added field is going to be implied in relation to the existing composition of field and figures. Each field should address the existing grain of the composition as a whole, the defined field, or the original figures. In addition, they can touch both figure or field or not touch them. They can overlap your figure, field, or both, and they can cross either figure, field, or both. This second field will multiply the complexity of the overall composition. Please pay attention to the conditions of transparency and opacity that are a product of the addition of the second trace field. Your section TA will help you interpret terms and specific requirements, and there are 8 cards in this exercise. Look carefully at the examples. Test figures first before actually gluing them down. Cut all your figures and fields with precision. Again, just like the example that I showed earlier, this is one example, and this is how, with a very simple composition like you've seen, you can begin to add more layers of fields. So in your compositions, you are going to take your compositions that have the black figures and an A3 the yellow field, and you're going to simply add one more yellow field to those. In any composition, figures generate boundaries that define edges. In contrast, the geometry of the composition, including existing field geometries, repetition, and gestalt closure, imply other edges. Implied forms therefore respond to the underlying organizational structure. In the examples to the right, the proportional geometries of both figure and field account for measurement and placement. I would encourage you to look at each of these and try to understand how the additional fields are implied. Diagram 1, field is defined by the boundaries. In diagram 2, the field is implied by subdivision. In number 3, field is implied by center axis. In 4, fields implied by field geometry and proportion. And then in number 5, fields are implied by boundary and internal geometry. So you should start to think about how your fields, how you would explain how the fields that you choose are implied. Again, you can see the top right, the beginning composition, and then how 2 different versions of an additional yellow field that's been added. Here are 2 more examples of additional yellow fields. These are staggered figures, and I'm going to show you a number of ways that a second field has been added. 2 more. Edge-aligned figures, again, more examples of how this can be developed. And then fitted figures. So some of the ways that that I would relate this to architecture and actual buildings is by how landscapes and extensions of a piece of architecture can start to connect the inside with the outside. So this is the Schindler House by Rudolf Schindler in LA. And you can see here, this is the floor plan of the building. So there are walkways, there are interior rooms. Some of the very dark rectangle pieces, those are actually fireplaces, so that they start to read as figures when you look at them in the plan. And then when you look at this house and its site plan, so in the bottom left is the original floor plan that I showed you. The top right, that picture or that image shows you this whole site plan. So there's areas that start to connect this building with its surrounding landscape. On the right, those are some of the images of the actual building itself. Another example of an architect that I think does something very similar to what we're doing, where these implied fields are starting to connect the figures with the ground of your grids. In these projects, there are certain elements, landscape elements, uh, extensions from the building that start to connect the building with the landscape inside it. So here you can see a detailed version of the landscape in the larger plan, and then down lower you can see the site plan with some of the buildings that are around it and the roads around it. This is a project by Frank Lloyd Wright.